On a strange and distant planet, under an orange sun that seemed to hover too close, Marcus Hale had only one goal: survive. His ship, a sleek, high-tech explorer, had crashed into the thick jungle hours ago. The forest was alive with the sounds of creatures he couldn't identify. Growls, hums, and strange rustlings in the foliage that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Marcus had been in worse situations. He was a survivalist after all. But this was different. He could feel it in his bones. Someone, or something, was watching him. At first, it had seemed like nothing, just the usual paranoia you get when you're alone in a strange place. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. The subtle sounds behind him, the flicker of movement between the trees, the shadows that didn't quite match the angle of the setting sun. He wasn't alone. The deep red of the jungle foliage mixed with the vibrant purple flowers that dotted the ground, but Marcus didn't notice the beauty. His senses were focused elsewhere. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the dense undergrowth, sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The forest itself was a maze, and the planet, if you could even call it that, felt almost alive, as if it was aware of his every move. Hours had passed, and he had yet to find a safe spot to rest. His food supplies were limited, his water filter nearly dry. His only hope was to reach the crash site and signal for rescue. But first, he had to survive whatever was hunting him. His breath was shallow, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, scanning every corner of the jungle for movement. There was no mistaking it now. Something was close. Marcus wasn't an amateur. He knew the signs of being stalked, and he knew how to outsmart whatever predator was after him. He crouched low to the ground, adjusting his pack and his worn-out boots, carefully watching the surroundings. Then it happened. A snap of a branch just behind him, too close. He spun, pulling a knife from its sheath, heart racing, muscles tense. For a moment, he saw nothing but the dark trees and the wild underbrush. Nothing. But then she appeared. A figure stepped from the shadows, her presence as sudden and terrifying as a storm. Marcus froze, his breath catching in his throat. She was tall, easily over 6 feet, with skin that shimmered like molten red steel under the strange sunlight. Her eyes glowed with a fierce amber hue, scanning him like an apex predator. She was armed. Her weapon, a long double-bladed spear, hummed with a low energy. Her armor was unlike anything he'd ever seen, constructed from bone, metal, and strange organic materials that seemed to pulse with life. Her long black hair was braided, hanging over one shoulder, and her expression, unreadable, was fierce. She was no ordinary hunter. She was Vereshka, a Zarethian warrior, and she had been tracking him since his ship had crashed. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. This was no mere survival challenge. This was a game, a deadly game. Vereshka wasn't here for food or resources. She was here to test him, to hunt him, and if he failed, the consequences would be swift. There was no negotiation, no mercy. The hunt had begun, and the forest was her arena. With a low growl, Vereshka tightened her grip on the spear and took a slow step toward him. The challenge was clear: run or fight. Marcus stood frozen, his breath sharp and quick. The woman in front of him wasn't human. There was no doubt about that. Her crimson skin glowed faintly under the orange sky, and her eyes, bright amber like molten fire, held no emotion. She wasn't scared. She wasn't worried. She was simply waiting. And Marcus knew, without a doubt, that she was ready to end him if he didn't move fast. Her spear was long and sleek, glowing with an eerie blue light. It was no ordinary weapon. Marcus had seen high-tech gear before, but this was something else entirely, alien, unfamiliar, and clearly deadly. Vereshka didn't speak, but her presence was enough to make the air crackle with tension. Marcus could feel her eyes on him, studying him like he was a piece of prey, weighing whether he was worth the chase. He had no time to wonder about the strange woman's intentions. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins as he calculated his options. He could run, but that would make him an easy target. The jungle was dense, and it wouldn't take long for her to catch up. He could fight, but he was only armed with a small knife, and she had a spear. He didn't know what kind of strength she had, but she looked powerful, like a warrior born for this. Neither choice seemed like a winning one, but he didn't have much of a choice. For a moment, they stood there in a deadly silence, the air thick with anticipation. The sound of birds and insects in the jungle faded as Marcus tried to steady his breath. The forest was still, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, she moved. Vereshka lunged forward with incredible speed, her spear flashing in the fading light. Marcus barely had time to react. He ducked to the side, feeling the rush of air as the spear missed him by inches, its energy blade crackling as it sliced through the air. The ground beneath him shook as he rolled to his feet, his heart racing. His mind screamed at him to move faster, but his body was already ahead of him, instinctively dodging her next strike. The jungle around them seemed to come alive as Marcus scrambled to stay one step ahead. He leaped over rocks, ducked under vines, and zigzagged through the trees, his mind focused only on staying out of her reach. She was fast. Too fast. Marcus could hear her footsteps behind him, feel the brush of her spear slicing the air with each deadly swing. She was toying with him, enjoying the chase. Marcus's mind raced. There had to be something, anything, that could give him an edge. His eyes darted around, searching for anything he could use to his advantage. The thick vines above him were within reach. He grabbed one, swinging it like a rope, and using the momentum to leap to the side, narrowly avoiding another strike. But that only slowed her down for a moment. She was relentless, never giving him a chance to catch his breath. As Marcus rounded a bend in the path, he spotted something ahead. An old, weathered tree with thick roots that snaked across the ground like giant fingers. It was a perfect place to set a trap. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest as he quickly formulated a plan. With a quick glance, he noticed that the ground was soft here, and the roots were tangled together. He darted forward, moving just out of sight behind the tree. He could feel Vereshka's presence growing closer. The sound of her footsteps was unmistakable. He held his breath, his fingers wrapped tightly around the knife in his hand, praying that his plan would work. She stepped into view, her spear raised, eyes fixed on him. And then, with all the force he could muster, Marcus swung around the tree and struck. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he swung the knife, aiming for a weak spot in Vereshka's armor. His plan had been simple: distract her, get close, and strike fast. But his strike never landed. Vereshka was too quick, too aware. With a flick of her wrist, she deflected his blow with her spear, sending his knife skittering to the ground. The impact of the spear against the blade sent a sharp, painful jolt through his arm, making him wince. For a brief moment, they both stood there, locked in a tense standoff. Marcus out of breath and backing away, and Vereshka, her amber eyes narrowed with intense focus. Her lips curled into a slight smile, but it wasn't one of kindness. It was a smile that told him she was enjoying this, enjoying the challenge. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a game. A deadly game. "You're quick, human," Vereshka said, her voice low and steady, with a strange cadence to it, but not quick enough. Marcus's eyes flicked to his knife, just out of reach. He couldn't let her know how much pain he was in from that last blow. His mind raced, calculating his next move, but she wasn't giving him a moment to think. She moved with a predator's grace, stepping toward him, her spear raised again. The glowing energy blade hummed in the air, ready to strike. Without warning, she lunged. Marcus had no choice but to dive to the side, narrowly avoiding the tip of her spear that sliced through the air where his head had been moments before. The ground beneath him was wet and slippery, but he managed to roll and scramble back onto his feet. His heart was racing now, his body screaming in protest from the exertion, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give up. Vereshka was relentless. With every step, she closed the distance between them, and every time he dodged, she was right there, waiting for his next mistake. Her speed was something Marcus had never seen before, almost otherworldly. She moved like she was born to hunt, born to kill. Marcus knew he couldn't outrun her forever. The jungle around him was thick with trees and vines, but there was nowhere to hide. The terrain was unfamiliar to him, and every turn seemed to lead him deeper into a corner. His only chance was to turn the tables somehow, to force her to make a mistake. But she was a warrior. She had spent her entire life perfecting her skills. Marcus was just a man, trying to survive in a place that was trying to kill him. He glanced up, spotting a large rock up ahead, half buried in the underbrush. It was big enough to create some cover, maybe enough for him to catch his breath and regroup. He had to get there first. Marcus sprinted toward the rock, but Vereshka was right behind him. Her speed was unmatched. As he reached the rock and ducked behind it, he heard her footsteps stop. The forest fell silent again, the only sound the beating of his heart in his chest. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. Then Vereshka's voice broke the silence. "This is the trial, human," she said, her voice echoing in the space between them. "You are the prey. I am the hunter. There is no escape." Marcus's pulse thudded in his ears. She wasn't just hunting him. She was testing him, watching him, waiting to see if he was worthy of survival. He had no idea what kind of test this was, but he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't find a way to turn this around, he wouldn't make it out alive. Marcus crouched behind the rock, trying to control his ragged breathing. His mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest. He could hear Vereshka moving. Soft, deliberate steps through the underbrush. He didn't know where she was, but he felt her presence like a shadow looming over him. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If he didn't think of something fast, he was going to be dead. The problem was, he couldn't predict her movements. Vereshka was too skilled, too experienced. Every time he thought he had a plan, she was already one step ahead. Marcus had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. This wasn't just survival. This was a test that he couldn't afford to fail. The rock he was hiding behind offered little protection, and his body was screaming for rest. His legs ached, his chest burned, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. A soft rustle of leaves made his pulse spike. She was close. He gripped his knife tighter, his only weapon, and tried to steady himself. If he could just get the drop on her, if he could just create a moment of distraction, he might have a chance to escape. And then something unexpected happened. A loud, high-pitched screech echoed through the forest, sending a shiver down Marcus's spine. The sound came from a creature, large, with multiple legs and glowing eyes, moving fast through the trees. Vereshka paused. Marcus couldn't see her, but he could hear the slight change in her breathing. She wasn't focused on him anymore. Whatever that creature was, it had captured her attention. This was his moment. Without wasting a second, Marcus darted out from behind the rock, his body moving instinctively. He didn't know if he had time to think. He just moved. His feet pounded the soft ground, his body low to avoid being seen, but his mind was already working a few steps ahead. He needed to get to higher ground, somewhere she couldn't easily reach him. The creature screeched again, closer this time. Marcus didn't know what it was, but he didn't care. It was his chance. The dense forest opened up into a small clearing, and ahead, he spotted a cliff face, just high enough to give him a good vantage point. If he could make it there, he'd be able to see everything, maybe even spot a way out of this nightmare. He pushed his body harder, his legs burning with every step. The clearing was just a few dozen yards away. His chest was tight with fear, his breath coming in short bursts, but he couldn't stop now. not when he was this close. Suddenly, a blur of motion appeared in front of him. Vereshka. She was back, her spear raised and ready to strike. Marcus had no time to react. She was too fast. But then, the creature, a massive, spider-like beast, burst out from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Vereshka's focus shifted instantly, her spear slashing at the creature in one swift, fluid motion. She had no time for Marcus. Marcus, now just a few feet from the cliff, took his chance. He leaped up onto the rocky ledge, his fingers catching the edge just in time. With one final, desperate heave, he pulled himself up, rolling onto solid ground and gasping for air. He had done it. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus allowed himself a moment of victory. He wasn't dead. He wasn't caught. He had escaped, just barely. But as he caught his breath and peered down at the scene below, he saw that Vereshka had not given up. She was already dealing with the creature, her spear flashing through the air with deadly precision. The hunt was far from over. And as Marcus looked around, he realized that the jungle was just as dangerous as the warrior woman herself. There was no safe place here. The trial was still on. Marcus lay flat against the rocky ledge, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he watched Vereshka battle the creature below. Her movements were flawless, a perfect blend of speed and power. The spider-like creature lunged at her, but she dodged easily, slashing with her spear and sending sparks flying from its metallic body. It screeched in fury, its many legs scrambling for balance. Marcus had to admit it was impressive. She wasn't just hunting him. She was a warrior, born for this. But even as she fought, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, a soft rumble like a distant earthquake. The air had grown thicker, heavier, and the sky was beginning to darken. The forest was changing. Suddenly, the creature howled one last time and collapsed to the ground, its body twitching in the final throes of death. Vereshka stood over it, her spear raised triumphantly, the eerie blue glow of the blade reflecting in her amber eyes. But she didn't celebrate. Her gaze snapped upward, scanning the jungle around her as if something had caught her attention. Marcus barely had time to react. The ground beneath him cracked with a deafening sound, and before he could even move, the cliff face split open, sending a massive rift through the earth. A thick, dark energy pulsed from the crack, and an unnatural wind howled through the trees, pulling at the foliage around him. The jungle seemed to come alive in a way he had never felt before. Vereshka's eyes widened, and for the first time, Marcus saw something close to fear in her expression. She moved quickly, dropping to her knees and placing her hand against the ground. She muttered something in a language Marcus didn't understand, her voice a low, urgent chant. The earth trembled again, the rift widening, and Marcus could feel the heat radiating from it, an oppressive, burning force that threatened to tear the jungle apart. "This is not good," Vereshka said, standing up with a look of determination. "The Tel Kor." Marcus had no idea what she was talking about, but he didn't need to. The ground shook again, and out of the rift, something began to emerge. The air was filled with an oppressive energy, and the jungle's quiet alien atmosphere turned to chaos. Large, grotesque figures started to climb from the opening, beings that looked like twisted versions of the creatures Marcus had fought back on Earth. They were huge, towering over him, their bodies covered in dark, metallic exoskeletons and glowing red eyes. "They've returned," Vereshka muttered under her breath, her voice full of grim understanding. She turned to face Marcus. "The Tel Kor are the ancient enemies of my people. They've been lost for centuries, but now they've come back." Marcus's mind was racing. He didn't know what these Tel Kor were, but he could see one thing clearly. They were not something he wanted to fight. They were massive, and their limbs ended in sharp, jagged claws. As the creatures stepped fully into the clearing, the air seemed to crackle with their unnatural presence. The jungle around them was dying. the trees wilting, the flowers fading into nothingness. The ground continued to tremble as Vereshka adjusted her grip on her spear, a grim resolve settling in her eyes. You should run. This is no longer about the hunt. This is about survival. Marcus's heart raced. He had no idea what the Cell Corps were or why they were here, but one thing was clear. There was no time to think. Vereshka was right. The hunt had ended. What was coming from the rift wasn't just a creature to be outwitted or outrun. It was an enemy, and it was about to tear through the jungle like a storm. Without a word, Marcus took a deep breath and prepared himself. The jungle had just turned into something far more dangerous. Marcus's heart raced as the Cell Corps stepped fully into the clearing. The ground beneath them cracked as they moved, their jagged claws dragging across the earth with a low, eerie scraping sound. Vereshka's eyes locked on the creatures, her body tense, every muscle primed for action. She was a warrior. This was her world. But Marcus could see the weight of the situation in her eyes. She was not afraid, but even she knew how serious this was. The largest of the Cell Corps was the first to move, its body towering above the others like a shadow, its red eyes glowing brighter with every step. It hissed, a sound that rattled Marcus's bones. Its voice was not a sound he could hear, but a feeling he could feel. A deep, vibrating hum that seemed to echo through his chest. The other creatures followed, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They weren't just beasts. They were something far more dangerous. Vereshka's spear glowed as she raised it in front of her, the energy blade pulsing with an almost unnatural light. "Stay behind me," she ordered Marcus, her voice calm, but there was a fire behind it, a fierce determination. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." Marcus wanted to protest. He wanted to do something, anything, but he had no weapon, no real training. All he had was the knowledge of a world far away from this jungle. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for the Cell Corps. But before he could respond, one of the creatures lunged. Its claws tore through the air with terrifying speed. Vereshka moved first, her spear a blur as she slashed at the creature's arm, sparks flying as the blade met its hard exoskeleton. The creature screeched, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down Marcus's spine, but the wound was shallow, barely a scratch. Vereshka backed up, her eyes narrowed, clearly frustrated. "This is no ordinary enemy," she muttered, looking over her shoulder at Marcus. "These creatures are ancient. Their armor is nearly impenetrable, and they are relentless." The largest Cell Corps stepped forward then, its massive arms raised, and with a terrifying roar, it swung its claws toward Vereshka. Marcus's stomach twisted, his body frozen in fear. But Vereshka wasn't frozen. She was already moving, weaving through the air with the grace of someone who had spent her life in combat. Her spear clashed with the creature's claws, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through the air. Marcus watched in awe as Vereshka fought, her every movement fluid, precise, and dangerous. But even she was struggling. The Cell Corps weren't giving her an inch. She was fast, but the creatures were stronger, their numbers overwhelming. For every strike she landed, another claw would swipe at her, forcing her to retreat, her boots sliding against the slick, shaking ground. "Run," Vereshka shouted suddenly, her voice sharp. "Get to the ridge. Now." The urgency in her voice snapped Marcus out of his shock. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, pushing through the dense jungle as quickly as he could. His feet were heavy, his body aching from the earlier fight, but he had no choice. Vereshka needed time. She couldn't take them all on alone. As he sprinted, the ground trembled again, and Marcus could hear the deep, resounding growls of the Cell Corps behind him. His mind raced. Where was the ridge? Where could he go that might give him a chance to help? He didn't know, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep running. He had to get out of the clearing. Then, through the trees ahead, he saw it. The ridge, a steep, rocky incline that led up to a small plateau. It wasn't much, but it was higher ground. It was a chance. With renewed determination, Marcus pushed himself harder, his legs screaming in protest as he made a beeline for the ridge. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All that mattered was reaching the top. And as the Quetzalcoatl's roars echoed in the distance, Marcus knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. Marcus's lungs burned as he reached the top of the ridge, his legs shaky from the effort. He couldn't stop now. The jungle below him was a blur of shifting shadows and twisted trees, and he could still hear the Quetzalcoatl's growls echoing through the air, too close for comfort. His heart raced, but he pushed forward, his feet scrambling over the rocks, his mind focused on nothing but escape. The plateau at the top of the ridge was small, surrounded by jagged cliffs, but it offered one thing: a vantage point. Marcus could see the entire clearing below him, Vereshka still locked in battle with the Quetzalcoatl. She was holding her ground, but it was clear that the creatures were gaining on her. Their movements were too fast, too calculated. They were relentless, their dark red eyes glowing as they closed in on her position. Come on, come on," Marcus muttered under his breath, his eyes darting from Vereshka to the Quetzalcoatl. There had to be a way to help her. He couldn't just leave her to fight alone. But what could he do? He was no warrior. He had no weapon. He was out of his element. The truth hit him hard. He had no choice but to survive. He wasn't prepared for this. Suddenly, a scream split the air. It was Vereshka. Marcus's stomach clenched. His eyes locked onto her figure as she fought fiercely, but one of the Quetzalcoatl had managed to land a blow. She staggered back, her arm bleeding where the creature had slashed her. She was hurt. She needed help. Without thinking, Marcus dropped to his knees, searching the ground around him. His eyes scanned desperately for anything that could be used as a weapon. Then his gaze landed on a sharp rock, its edge glinting in the fading light. He grabbed it, his fingers slick with sweat, as he held the jagged stone in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With the makeshift weapon in hand, Marcus stood, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't just watch anymore. He had to do something. He sprinted back down the ridge, his feet slipping on the loose rocks as he descended. His breath came in heavy gasps as he pushed himself harder, the pain in his legs forgotten. The Quetzalcoatl were still focused on Vereshka, giving him a chance to get closer. He had to get to her, fast. As he reached the base of the ridge, he saw the largest of the Quetzalcoatl closing in on Vereshka. It raised its claws, preparing for the final strike. Vereshka was struggling, her movements slower now, the blood from her wound staining her armor. Marcus's pulse quickened. He couldn't think. He just acted. He charged forward, the stone clutched tightly in his hand. With a yell, he hurled the rock at the creature's head. The impact was loud, but it didn't faze the Quetzalcoatl. It whipped around, its glowing eyes narrowing in on Marcus. The creature's attention was now fully on him. For a moment, there was only the sound of Marcus's heart pounding in his ears, the Quetzalcoatl's red eyes boring into his soul. He had only one chance. Vereshka, now recovered, moved swiftly, her spear flashing as she darted in and struck. The Quetzalcoatl howled in pain, distracted just long enough for her to land a solid blow. It stumbled back, its claws scratching the earth as it fell to the ground with a thunderous crash. Marcus stood frozen, watching as Vereshka's spear pierced the creature's chest, its glowing eyes dimming as it crumpled to the earth. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Vereshka turned to him, her amber eyes piercing through the chaos. "You're still alive," she said, her voice gruff, but with a hint of approval. Marcus could barely find the strength to reply, his body trembling with adrenaline. "What now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Now," she said, looking toward the remaining Quetzalcoatl, "we finish what we started." The jungle was eerily quiet after the fall of the first Quetzalcoatl, but Marcus knew it wouldn't last. The other creatures were still there, watching, waiting for their chance to strike. The air was thick with the smell of blood and the crackle of tension, and Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he stood beside Vereshka, both of them taking a moment to catch their breath. Vereshka's spear was still glowing, her stance steady, but the damage from the battle was clear. Her armor was scratched, her body covered in dirt and blood. Yet her eyes burned with fierce determination, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for her. She was a warrior in every sense of the word, someone who never backed down, no matter the odds. But Marcus wasn't a warrior. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. All he knew was that he couldn't let her fight alone. The remaining cell core began to circle them, their movements deliberate, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. There were 4 of them now, each one larger and more menacing than the last. Their claws scraped against the earth, and their chittering growls filled the air like a symphony of dread. "Stay close," Vereshka ordered, her voice low but steady. "And don't make a sound unless you're sure." Marcus nodded, clutching the sharp rock in his hand, the only weapon he had. It felt insignificant compared to the cell core's deadly claws and thick armor, but it was all he had, and he had to make it count. The cell core lunged first. One of them rushed at Vereshka, its massive claws raised to strike. Vereshka sidestepped with the grace of a panther, her spear flashing as she thrust it toward the creature's side. It howled in pain, but the wound was shallow, just a scratch against its thick armor. Vereshka didn't falter, though. She was already moving again, her feet light as she danced around the creature, staying one step ahead of its vicious attacks. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't keep up with her speed, but he had to do something. He had to help her. As Vereshka continued to fight, Marcus saw an opening. One of the cell core was distracted, focused on Vereshka's spear, leaving its side exposed. Without thinking, Marcus sprinted forward, the sharp rock gripped tightly in his hand. He closed the distance quickly, his breath ragged as he plunged the stone into the creature's side. It screeched in surprise, its body jerking as Marcus twisted the rock in the wound. The creature turned its glowing eyes toward him, in rage. Marcus froze, his body trembling as the cell core's clawed hand swung toward him. But before it could strike, Vereshka was there. She slid in between Marcus and the creature, her spear slamming into the cell core's neck with a sickening crunch. The creature let out a final, screeching roar before it collapsed, its body crumpling to the ground. Marcus's breath came in shallow gasps, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had done it. He had helped. But there was no time to celebrate. The other 3 cell core were still closing in, their eyes filled with malice. "Move," Vereshka shouted, her voice commanding. She spun on her heels and launched herself at the next creature, her spear cutting through the air with deadly precision. Marcus followed, his heart pounding in his chest as he searched for another opportunity to strike. The fight was far from over. The battle raged on, each swing of the spear, each strike of the claws, a blur of motion. Vereshka and Marcus worked in sync, each covering the other's back, their movements fluid and determined. The remaining cell core were relentless, but they weren't invincible. With every strike, they grew weaker, their armor cracking under the pressure. Then, with one final powerful thrust, Vereshka drove her spear through the heart of the last cell core. It fell to the ground with a deafening thud, its body shuddering before it went still. Marcus stood there, panting, his body exhausted from the fight. The jungle was quiet now, save for the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Vereshka wiped the blood from her spear, her amber eyes flicking over to Marcus. "You did well," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of something else, something like respect. Marcus didn't know what to say. He had survived. He had helped. And for the first time since he'd arrived in this alien world, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. But as the jungle began to settle, Marcus knew this fight wasn't over. The rift was still open, and the threat of the cell core was far from gone. And as Verishka glanced at the horizon, her expression hardening, Marcus realized that they would need to face whatever came next, together. The jungle was silent once more, the only sound now the soft rustle of the wind through the leaves. Marcus stood in the aftermath of the battle, his body aching and bruised, but his spirit alive with the rush of survival. The ground around them was littered with the fallen bodies of the XL Corps, their dark forms a grim reminder of the chaos they had just faced. Vereshka stood beside him, her amber eyes scanning the horizon, as if expecting another attack. Her movements were calculated, purposeful, but there was something in the air that made Marcus uneasy. The fight was over, but the war wasn't. Vereshka finally turned to him, wiping the blood from her spear. She said nothing for a long moment, her gaze flicking from the bodies to the jungle around them. Then, in a voice that was quiet but filled with resolve, she spoke. "You've proven yourself today," she said, her eyes narrowing as they met his. "Not many survive an encounter like this, let alone fight back." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. He had barely done anything. It was Vereshka who had done most of the fighting, guiding him, protecting him, and using her strength to defeat the XL Corps. He was just a man from Earth, a stranger in an alien world. But he had fought. He had fought for his life, and for hers. And that, in itself, had to count for something. "I just did what I had to do," Marcus replied, his voice rough but sincere. Vereshka gave a single, sharp nod. She didn't need words of praise. She was a warrior, and in her world, action spoke louder than anything else. But there was a flicker of something like respect, shining in her eyes as she turned her attention back to the jungle. The silence stretched out between them, filled only by the distant calls of unknown creatures. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bigger than what they had already faced. The rift still loomed, its pull drawing him back to the unknown. And with the XL Corps gone, for now, that threat remained. "We can't stay here," Vereshka said after a long pause, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "There's more danger ahead, more creatures like those. We need to move quickly, while we still have time." Marcus nodded. "Where do we go?" Vereshka glanced over her shoulder at the path they had taken through the jungle. "There's an ancient city deep within the jungle. It's hidden, lost to time, but it might hold the answers we need. It might hold the key to closing the rift and ending the XL Corps threat for good." The idea of traveling deeper into the jungle, facing more dangers, made Marcus's stomach turn. He had already been through so much, and the thought of walking into even greater unknowns was terrifying. But he couldn't ignore the fact that this was their only chance. If they were going to survive, and if he was going to find a way back home, they had to take the risk. He glanced at Vereshka, the warrior who had become his ally, his guide. She had proven herself time and time again, and there was a part of him that wanted to follow her anywhere. He didn't know what lay ahead, but with her by his side, maybe, just maybe, he could make it through. "We'll find it," Marcus said, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "Together." Vereshka looked at him, her amber eyes steady. Then she turned and began walking, her steps sure and confident, leading the way through the jungle. Marcus followed, his heart pounding with both fear and hope. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers countless, but one thing was clear: they had survived this far, and they would keep fighting for as long as it took. With each step, they moved closer to the ancient city, and to the secrets that could change everything.